In the last several years, actually in the last now 12 or 13 years since I've been in the business of teaching and promoting and trying to advance the understanding of nonviolent resistance, one of the most common questions that I get asked and that I know others in this room have been asked is they'll say, well, tell me how it works, or they'll say, why doesn't it work in this circumstances? Or don't you think it doesn't work well here because of these particular conditions? And what's common to all those questions is the word "it," as if we're talking about a unified, controllable phenomenon, like dishwasher detergent that comes out of a bottle, or powder that comes out of a box so that you can wash your clothes in it. Actually, tonight you'll see an illustration based on that idea, which has unfortunately continued to foster the idea that we're really talking about some magic powder that you can go and distribute over people or over a field of conflict, and somehow this will make things better. So when I hear that word "it," the first thing that I will say is, it is not an "it." It is a system of action, a methodology of action, in which there are ideas that must be understood so that the use of its practices can be understood, so that one will be able to see, in fact, how to use those practices. But we have to call it something, so we're increasingly calling it civil resistance, and that's for a few reasons. That's a term which has been used in European academia a bit longer than in North America to effectively describe civilian-based resistance or nonviolent resistance. It doesn't include the word nonviolent, which still in a number of places in the world there are inhibitions to accepting, because there is the view that somehow it's a philosophy, and I don't have time for a philosophy, I don't have time to change my behavior before I can learn this, I just want something that I can use. So if you start with the term civil resistance, there is less resistance to the idea of it than there is otherwise.
Gandhi
But that's,
used the word.
yes, he did. He also used the word. It has a long and honorable pedigree. The subject of this week is obviously an emerging force for rights in the world as it's manifested in so many different campaigns and movements, and it is also, for those who are rightly worried about a world which is too violent, an alternative to violence. This man, Frederick Douglass, an African American who lived in the 19th century, had perhaps the best understanding of the central dynamic in the use of civil resistance in his age. And he said this: power, constituted power, state power, the power of an oppressor, concedes nothing, and it never will. Find out what any people will submit to, and you have found the exact measure of the injustice and the wrong which will be imposed on them. And these will continue until they're resisted. There's no such thing as oppressive power or power that denies someone else their rights which voluntarily relinquishes itself. So the limits of tyrants, Douglass said, are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress, which is one of the reasons why so many campaigns and movements in the world, in their own local language, often come up with the slogan, as one of their many slogans, "We've had enough. Time is up. We're not putting up with this any longer." Their endurance has passed. Frederick Douglass, by the way, was the first African American ever invited to the White House by a United States president, who was Abraham Lincoln, who was very influenced in his conduct of the remainder of the Civil War by what Douglass represented and spoke. And to this day, unfortunately, in America, Frederick Douglass's contribution to the history of the United States is not well appreciated. almost a half century later, this gentleman, who most people in this room have read in one form or another, Leo Tolstoy, in his writings against conscription in Tsarist Russia, also understood this fundamental dynamic and projected his understanding of the power that it could produce in historical terms. He said, he predicted that sometime in the future, public opinion, which by the way he didn't understand to mean the results of an opinion poll, but what all people understood and felt and wished to have occur in their society, that public opinion would one day change the whole structure of life. He understood that it could change every power relationship, and that would change the whole structure of life, not just political, but also economic and social, and that would make violence superfluous, unnecessary, not needing to be used for any purpose for which it had been used earlier in history. And as we know, Gandhi was very influenced by Tolstoy's thinking. They even had a correspondence just before Tolstoy's death in about 100 years ago, by the way. And Gandhi said that Tolstoy's thinking made him see the potential of resistance, and then the modes of resistance he was reading about himself, because he was a voracious newspaper reader. Irish resistance to British rule, the 1905 Bolshevik not the Bolshevik Revolution, the first actually mostly nonviolent revolution against Tsarist Russia, when there were strikes and marches and demonstrations throughout the scope of the Russian Empire, which produced substantial political reform, but no true revolution at that time. Gandhi absorbed all of this and put it into practice when he was a lawyer in South Africa campaigning against systemic state discrimination and repression against people of color in South Africa. Lessons that he took back to India in increasing the number of what he called nonviolent weapons that he was using in the struggle against the control of the British Empire of the Indian subcontinent. Mass marches and protests, refusal to pay taxes, boycotts, resignations by Indians who worked for the British Raj, active interference in the operations of the Raj. Because of Gandhi's inspiration and his teaching, all these things were used in campaigns in India beginning in the early 1920s and continuing through the mid-1930s. This was a new way to rise up. By the way, it was that president who invited Frederick Douglass to the White House who suggested in a speech when he was a congressman in 1848, we know how many revolutions happened in Europe coincidentally that same year, it was Lincoln who said that there existed a human right to rise up and to throw off existing governments if they were oppressive. And that rising up became practical when Gandhi proliferated tactics that ordinary people could use, which had to be nonviolent, because most people won't be violent, in order to challenge the oppression that he faced in his native India. What this modeled was a new idea of power, of human power, not just political power, based on that idea that Douglass framed in the previous century, which was that I take my cooperation away from you, I refuse to acknowledge your legitimacy, I refuse to do anything that enables you to continue to hold on to power, and enough people do that, and that withdrawal of consent reduces, depreciates the power available to the state, to the oppressor, to use. Gandhi's actions so impressed the people in the British government in London, not just the British Raj in India, who were responsible for administering India under the empire. That so impressed them that this one gentleman, Sir Charles Innes, said, finally concluded, England can hold India only by consent. He didn't understand the consent theory of power. He just saw that tens of millions of Indians were saying, we're not cooperating any longer with this empire. By the way, Gandhi, his fundamental unifying proposition, the way he got Indians to participate in that movement, was effectively to say in so many different ways, but this was the core proposition, the British are running India for their benefit. Why should we help them? Many different injunctions to take action were implicit in that statement. Many of the tactics of resistance that were used then and in other important nonviolent campaigns in the 19th century as well as in the 20th century can be divided up conveniently into these three categories given to us by the American scholar Gene Sharp, who will be speaking here on Thursday. Tactics of protest and persuasion, petitions, symbols, vigils, marches, walkouts, using nonviolent action as a way to organize and mobilize people, to alert them to the issues, to help them understand the cause, to welcome and to incite others to join you. Tactics of non-cooperation, which is really where you get into withdrawing your consent and diminishing the available power of the oppressor. Boycott, strike, sit-ins, civil disobedience, and then physical intervention, in which you're doing things directly to drive up the cost of that oppression. And so the dynamic of civil resistance as a way to affect power and how it's used in a society consists, in my judgment, of this. When the people deprive an oppressor of their consent by engaging in mass resistance, it reduces his legitimacy. All governments and all oppressors pretend that everybody loves them and that they should remain in power and they have legitimacy. Take that legitimacy away and you do what Vaclav Havel said you had to do to learn how to resist. You tell the truth. You tell the truth about the nature of the oppression. You call it by its name. You do not flinch from suggesting that it is wrong. It is wrong because it does not wield its power on behalf of those who are governed. The claim that it does is false. It is a lie. Every person who engages in nonviolent resistance is a truth teller by definition. So, when enough people refuse to cooperate, when many people are telling the truth, taking legitimacy away from the state and putting pressure on those authorities, it turns out that this increases the actual material cost of holding control in the society. It drives up the cost of oppression. When you think of mass actions and protests, only one category of tactics, but when you think of those tactics, more police, more soldiers, even if there isn't violence occurring yet, those people have to be deployed. In the film you saw last night about the leadership of Jim Lawson and the students that he taught in Nashville in engaging just in sit-ins in department stores, at lunch counters, more police had to work overtime. This was going to put, eventually, depending on how long this went on, this would put pressure on the city budget. And then when those who were arrested declined bail, they filled the jails up. So there were more people who had to man the jails at all times. These were real costs. And then the boycotted department stores were losing income. More costs that you're generating. You're not engaging in any convulsive or even that physically confrontative action, but nevertheless, you're imposing costs on the existing oppressive system. And so when the system's legitimacy goes down and the costs rise, what happens? The people who work for the system begin to say to themselves, this setup doesn't seem to be working as well as it used to. Something's changing here. This is not, I don't work 9 to 5 any longer. What are my expectations for the future? My expectations may have to change if this keeps going on. So enforcers begin to doubt its endurance, and that's very important because when there is the potential or the reality of violent repression, the people doing that violent repression, they're paid laborers for the state. They don't get that many benefits from what they do. If they begin to doubt whether they're going to be paid at some point in the future, or if they begin to doubt whether the system for which they are taking some risks becomes sustainable, then you begin to soften the will to continue the system of people who are even within that system. This type of resistance has had amazing historical results. These are just some of the major national political system changing movements that have been seen in the last 80 or 90 years. Gandhi's movement against the British Raj in India, a wonderful toppling in 30 days of a dictator in El Salvador in 1944, the civil rights movement in the United States, the movement against the military junta and repression in Argentina in the 1970s and early 1980s, the movement against the dictator Augusto Pinochet in Chile, the rise of solidarity in Poland, the People Power Revolution, as it was called, against the dictator Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines in 1986, the so-called Velvet Revolution, and then the other nonviolent revolutions that took place in Eastern Europe against one-party rule in those countries, particularly that in East Germany with the famous toppling of the Berlin Wall, an underappreciated but still very important movement in Mongolia, in which students, and it's using, by the way, their most important nonviolent tactic was fasting, which pushed substantial political reform in that country in 1990, a nonviolent insurrection against an authoritarian ruling group in Mali in 1991, the nonviolent resistance to the attempted military coup against Gorbachev and Yeltsin in 1991, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa lasting over 30 years, culminating in 1992, and then the so-called color revolutions. I wish they'd never call them color revolutions. If you want to know why, ask me a question. In Serbia, Georgia, and Ukraine in the early part of this decade, which were akin to the kinds of changes that took place in Eastern Europe, but happened much more quickly for a variety of reasons. The results of this resistance, framed a different way historically, were suggested in this study by Freedom House in 2005. In the 35 years between 1970 and 2005, there were actually 67 transitions in nations around the world from authoritarian to democratic governments. And in 50 of 67 transitions, in 50 of all of the 67 transitions to democracy at the national level in that 35-year period of time, the key factor was some form of nonviolent force mustered by ordinary people in campaigns or movements, usually involving political coalitions, diverse people participating. Let no one tell you that it doesn't work. It, which we now know is not an it, works. There are risks. It, if it's an it, which it isn't, doesn't always work. And one of the most important questions that we'll ask this week in a variety of contexts is, why not? Why was civil resistance not effective in this particular set of circumstances? Not because the magic powder didn't work, but because the way in which those practices were utilized in particular circumstances weren't effective. The question is, why wasn't civil resistance effective? A much better way in English to frame it rather than why didn't it work? The most spectacular failure to the public eye was in Tiananmen Square in June of 1989. You can find a segment of a chapter in our book, A Force More Powerful, which discusses our view of why that happened. I think this quote from the ancient Chinese military sage Sun Tzu suggests a reason for that when he said, "Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat," which is one of the reasons why the use of the word strategic by Peter Ackerman, probably his principal contribution in terms of nomenclature to the understanding of this field, putting strategic in front of nonviolent action or nonviolent conflict, as Jim Lawson emphasized last night, is terribly important. You have to have a plan. You have to do an assessment of your conditions. You have to inventory the strengths of your opponent. You have to inventory your strengths, his weaknesses, your weaknesses, and come to a considered decision about a sequence of action to take, which my colleagues will explore further later this afternoon and tomorrow morning. There have, however, been plenty of spectacular, pictorially well-represented triumphs of people power, such as the fall of the Berlin Wall, the enormous demonstration, the largest in modern times, certainly the largest in 30, 40 years in Washington, D.C., which Martin Luther King addressed in 1963. And they're important because they began to alert the world cumulatively as these successful struggles, when people power was used, became more evident. They began to alert the world that this was, in fact, a new form of political change that could have historic effects, which was occurring. And it was occurring with more frequency, as we've already seen in that list of successful movements. Something's going on. We have to understand it. The societies which have gone through this change, in my judgment, have experienced what I call emergent properties. There are properties that emerge within a society which is undergoing change through the use of civil resistance. And some of these properties I want to explore right now because they have to do with how sustainable the new order is, but they also reflect back on the motives, the hopes, the aspirations, and the psychology embedded in and represented by the action of all the people who participate in a change through a campaign or a movement. They emerge as a property of popular action, and they are imparted, in my judgment, to the way the society functions as it changes through the historical mechanism of the action of this campaign or movement. The first such property is itself consent. You take consent away, we've seen how that helps, that's part of the dynamic of making civil resistance work in a practical, material way. You take consent away from the oppressive order. Where does the consent go? Well, we take it away from the state and we say you have to consult us every 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years in elections to get our consent to keep the government going, which is the principle of electoral representation. That means that we're sovereign as the people. We give you our consent, and then you have legitimacy, but not until we give you our consent. This changes the idea of how you do power in a society, ultimately. And it filters down into all kinds of actions and activities during the course of normal social and political functioning. It also encourages the idea of participation. Every individual is able to... Why is it... At the end of this presentation, you'll see a slide where there's a picture of, tens of thousands of South Africans lining up in lines that went on for, miles and kilometers in order just to vote. Why are people so passionate about voting for the first time? Because there's something, they're giving something to themselves. They're giving legitimacy to the effort that they have engaged in to have this campaign and movement to produce this change. Retrospectively and prospectively, they're giving consent to a new order which has been brought into existence by this same action in first having civil resistance and then setting up that new order. So the withdrawal of consent creates space to resist. It changes the idea of power in the society. People think differently about how it's possible to maintain civil order. You can't organize a movement or a campaign by forcing people to join you. There's no such thing as involuntary participation in a nonviolent movement. It's only voluntary. You can't get anybody to follow you until you give them a good argument about what you stand for and why this effort is going to work. And to do that, you have to respect the mind of the people you're talking to. You have to welcome their thinking and their thoughts and their suggestions, not only about what the movement should do, but what it should stand for. This requires persuasion. It models something different in how people govern themselves. I'm going to have to try to persuade you that what I want us to do is going to work and is going to be successful. I cannot persuade you unless I'm honest. Even if I'm, a teller of amazing tall tales, even if I'm the biggest political con man, I'm only going to be able to convince a certain number of people that I'm right if I'm not honest. Imagine the effect that it has on a society that's had so little honesty, of suddenly having this flood of honest reason that's used in the Constitution and the maintenance of civil order. It makes the new system much more credible. Movements govern themselves. They model self-rule, and some have done so quite consciously. Leszek Kolakowski, a Polish intellectual in the 1970s, and Adam Michnik and other dissidents who were resisting Polish communist rule, noticing that violent worker insurrections were quickly snuffed out by the regime, said, well, we obviously are not going to do a revolution against the communists, so what we should do, this was their first idea, we should pretend the state doesn't exist and try to create space in which to organize ourselves and to do, and at least provide ourselves services that we wouldn't otherwise provide ourselves with. In fact, Solidarity grew out of workers' defense committees, essentially. Self-organization was an idea that Gandhi pioneered. The Hindu word Swaraj, literally meaning self-rule, was used by Gandhi to an extreme. I mean, he used the concept to an extreme because he wanted people to understand what it really took to own, to be stakeholders in a movement. He said, if we can't govern ourselves as individuals, how can we presume to govern our country? And when violence broke out in campaigns, he would call off the entire campaign, much to the horror of his political comrades who thought they were making progress. But he said, no, it's not going to work if this is what we model our action on. We have to be disciplined, and we have to plan, thus the need for nonviolent discipline, a term which my colleague Peter Ackerman has done much to insist is essential. When a movement represents, how many people are in a movement in a society of 20 million people, maybe 2 million, maybe 3 million, in a society of 50 million, maybe 4 or 5 million who are engaging in nonviolent tactics of one kind or another, but not 100% of the people. So that means that every movement is itself a representative body. It is doing representation. It models representation. It's saying these people's grievances and discontent need to be represented in order for national change to occur. This is where the agenda comes from. This means that leaders of movements have to listen to people. You can't just give orders. You have to delegate responsibility from the grassroots up. And you can't do that unless you have some degree of humility. Arrogant leaders are generally not effective as head of nonviolent campaigns and movements. And they're not hierarchical. Decision-making, as I said, is shared. So it's about solidarity of everyone, not heroism of a few charismatic leaders who want to be on attractive posters 30, 40, and 50 years from now. That's not what it's about. Forget the image of Che. It has really nothing to do with most of the nation-changing revolutions that have occurred in the last century or so. Representation is then absorbed as an idea of how you get change within the society. It places a premium on the ability to represent people's discontent. No movements succeed unless they can be sustained in the face of adversity. And that requires resilience. It's not just a matter of being able to mobilize and stay mobilized as a matter of, material, economic, and other concrete considerations. It's also a matter of continuing to impose strategic force on your opponent, building and maintaining momentum. There is, however, something that occurs within the people in a movement and in a campaign which is necessary to take cognizance of in order to account for the success of a campaign or a movement. And although I had known this in a notional way, before a conversation I had with Jim Lawson here at FSI a few years ago. He crystallized it for me when we were discussing the idea of the productive effect of engaging in a whole sequence of tactics. He made the argument to me in a one-on-one conversation late one night. He said, you know, there's another ingredient in this that is incredibly important. And then in further conversation, there was an example of this. I'll come back to what that ingredient was, stating it in a minute. But there was an example that he reminded me of, with which I was very familiar, and that's the example of this woman, Fannie Lou Hamer, who ran voter registration drives in Mississippi as part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. One night, after running a successful voter registration drive, she was driving herself home in her own car, and some white police officers pulled her car over, and beat her almost to death on the side of the road. And she was in a hospital for 30 days. On the 31st day, she goes out and starts another voter registration drive. Why does she do that? Jim Lawson asked. Why did she do that? Because she believed that if she didn't do it, the movement would fail. And if she did do it, the movement would succeed. Her sense of who she was so identified in her mind, and that reflected in her action, with the fate of the movement. And everyone else who followed her saw that form of action, that form of belief, that certitude of faith in the movement's eventual success if everyone participated, if everyone gave their all to this campaign or movement. This is about who you are at the end of the day, as I'll say later. This brings about the transformation in the society. If it's about your existence, then it's the existence of the nation and the society, because it's a matter of your own ability to exist as an honest, truth-telling person in the society. And this transformation, in order to be successful, awakens people to the understanding that there really aren't any monolithic enemies in a society. We don't have to take the losing side out and line them up against the wall and shoot them, because people make different calculations about what's possible and how it may be possible to live in a new order as the shape of this new order emerges during the course of the work of a nonviolent campaign or movement. This also helps make everyone a stakeholder in the eventual success. If you've been in a campaign for who knows any number of years, when the campaign is successful, when the movement succeeds, you then recognize, who did this? I did it. There's this wonderful moment at the end of the segment in A Force More Powerful on the movement in Chile, when the leader of the coalition, which finally ousted Pinochet in a plebiscite in 1988, when he said, on the day after they won the plebiscite, the people won the plebiscite, how many Chileans could say that they had done it? 7 million could say that they had done it. There were 7 million stakeholders. Everyone in the country effectively could say that in some way they were a participant, certainly an emotional participant, in this change that was accomplished. As I suggested a few minutes ago, this gentleman right here, Vaclav Havel, I think put his finger on why this all comes back to the individual's existential decision to unite his or her sense of the future with his or her sense of action. There was a direct relationship between the two. He says the dissident, the dissenter, the nonviolent action taker breaks the rules of the existing game of the oppressor. And that disrupts the game. We're changing the game. The old game isn't going to work anymore. We're going to make sure it doesn't work by the action we take. That shows everyone that it's possible to live within the truth. Some people are telling the truth. Some people have decided to change the basis of the theory on which the state rests, and therefore drain its legitimacy. And he said living within the lie of the system Oh, this is a great system. Everyone benefits from this. I oppress you and you benefit from it. Living within that lie can be the system comprehensively only if it's universal. If everybody is quiet or in some official way because they're afraid stipulates that they're going to go along with it. But there are no terms on which that system can coexist with living in the truth. And therefore, every person who steps out of line with the system denies it in principle, and this is the best part of this quote, and threatens it in its entirety, which is why totalitarian systems want to shoot the first dissident, because they understand this. There is a threat by a single protester holding a single sign because it says, these people are not telling the truth. I'm telling the truth. You decide. Decide whether what I'm saying about this system doesn't represent the truth and that we can, in fact, produce a better order. Whoops. So the basis of resistance is really a choice of identity. The question is, who are you? Are you the object of a ruling elite? Are you submissive to threats of violence? Or just the social anesthesia that prevails in the advanced industrial societies? Or are you a citizen? What an amazing idea. Are you a citizen? Able to resist the lie that injustice can't be opposed, able to develop other ways of producing power in the society. The demand for some form of struggle to produce a change in systems which are unfair, inequitable, corrupt, oppressive, or tyrannical is nearly universal, certainly represented on every continent. There are struggles for self-determination in places like West Papua and Western Sahara. There are still several important historically yet to be successful struggles against dictatorship in countries like Syria, Belarus, and also, by the way, Fiji, which has a military dictator. Lots of French tourists going to Fiji wonder where the pressure point might be. American tourists too, for that matter. And there are campaigns to end violence and at a local level and even at a national level in countries such as Mexico and Nigeria. Systemic violence, often associated, as we know, with systemic corruption. Hardly a representation of true democracy, even in countries which are ostensible democracies. There is, however, a competitor to represent people who are discontent and oppressed, and who historically have had a bit better a chance at modeling themselves as the attractive revolutionaries who you should follow, in no small part due to the media. And that is violence, as we know, revolutionary violence. But the greatest case to be made against the use of insurrectionary violence as a methodology of liberation is not the case really that it is costly, because that case has always been made, but the case that it is much less effective. And we're finally getting, historically, great quantitative social science to demonstrate that. Dr. Eric Chenoweth will be here to make a presentation on Thursday morning, which will document, based on several years of a research study that she's conducted and a new book that is coming out called Why Civil Resistance Works. There was an article a few years ago that began to divulge the results of their research, and it showed that in a study of 323 insurrectionary campaigns in a 106-year period of time, violent campaigns could be said to have been successful in some tactical phase to produce some results in about 26% of cases, but that nonviolent campaigns can be said to have been successful in some phase of the life of the campaign in about 53% of cases. Over double the success rate. This is not understood by the mainstream media. It's understood by some independent journalists, some of whom are in this room, but it's not understood by the mainstream media. This is still a refutation of a default belief in the modern mind. The modern mind, insofar as violence is concerned, is the ancient mind. and it still hasn't been changed at a general level on this subject. Part of the work that we do, implicit in what we do, is to change people's minds about what works as a mechanism for change. Insofar, however, as there are successful campaigns, that mind will be changed. Remember I said a few minutes ago that one protester holding one sign is a threat to the oppression which that protester is challenging. There was one protester standing on a street corner by herself in South Africa in 1986 who held up this sign. You can see a photograph of that in the book, A Force More Powerful, which I think sums it all up. And that sign said, "To end violence." What kind of violence was she talking about? It might not just be the violence of the state, it might be also the violence of the people trying to take down the state. It may be internecine violence. It may be social violence, which is out of control. It may be third-party violence by organized gangs. A society which is dysfunctional can be dysfunctional for many reasons. But she said on this sign, "To end violence, struggle for justice." The sign did not say to end violence, be nonviolent, as if a nonviolent world could be produced by going door to door and trying to convince everybody in the world, please be nonviolent. That's petitionary action. There's nothing wrong with it, but it may take a while. This sign says struggle for justice, because if you produce justice, if you produce a more harmonious and effective society, which the legitimacy of which rests on the consent of everyone in the society, if you produce what Jim Lawson calls the beloved community, if you produce an order which is at least fairer and more just to everyone who is affected by that political order, you will have had to engage in a struggle which is going to change the society, as I've suggested. And that society is far less likely to tolerate repressive violence, to need insurrectionary violence, or to be a society in which anyone who feels they have to take action is likely to resort to violence. So we have at our hands an historical mechanism not only to dissolve oppression in almost all of its forms, but also to take away one of the principal rationales for the use of violence. There may always be extremist, irrational violence in societies and in the world as a whole, but that violence which is chosen for rational considerations can be undermined just by the continued effectiveness and success of nonviolent campaigns and movements. Thank you.
In your remarks in the presentation, you mentioned about, one of the things that I got out of your remarks is like you refuse to cooperate with the oppressor or whoever the authoritarian governments are and states they oppress, and you sort of reject everything. But what if you're in the sort of society, community, or even a regime that they do not have any engagement with the ordinary people, oppressors, the people.
The boroughs
already in the situation that there's not much cooperation or interdependence within their society, within their oppressed environment. What are their chances, or what are their other tools and tactics and reasoning to?
Right. Well, that objection presumes that the only important dimension of a struggle can be the withdrawal of action, participation, or work by the people within the system. But there is still a system of some kind. There is still income that system receives, and there is still a product which it must sell, and there are people who work within that system and who are paid. So there is still a system. There is still at least a political administration, even if that administration doesn't appear to need the people because it's got all the oil wells it needs. It can pump until the historical well is dry. People say, well, you'll never topple the Saudi royal family because they're sitting on the biggest pile of oil in the world. But even that system requires people to repair the bridges and build the fancier and refurbish the fancier airport and to do all the things in a society that requires a society to present to itself and to the outside world as successful, and indeed as not just to appear as successful, but to be successful. So what is the United Arab Emirates faced with right now? They're faced with lots and lots of hotel workers and common laborers who've been imported into the UAE from all over the world who are very unhappy. They're unhappy with the way they're paid. They're unhappy being housed in camps in the desert. They're unhappy because they're effectively indentured servants. They live in a condition of which is equivalent to indentured servitude. So, and this didn't really bother the UAE at all, much less anybody who decided to go stay in the Burj Al Arab or one of the other big buildings, because it wasn't that visible. The question is what those individuals can do to make themselves more visible and to make their discontent more obvious to those who are feeding income to that system. So even though there is plenty of wealth going into that country, there may still be mechanisms for beginning to question the system. Keep in mind, you don't start with driving. Non-cooperation isn't a truck that you drive into the plate glass window on the front of the oppressive system. It's more like taking a thread from the cuff and beginning to unravel the sweater. It's a question of unraveling. Where do you begin? Where's the point of greatest vulnerability? So my argument, I don't buy that fundamental objection to Burroughs. Does it make it more complicated? Does it require a different strategy? You bet your life it does. And the standard model of withdrawal of non-cooperation, you pull the economic rug or you pull the control rug out from under the authoritarian model, that doesn't work as effectively. There's no question about that. But my sense is that with deeper planning and analysis, you'll find some other way of getting this fundamental dynamic of civil resistance to begin to work, to begin the process of organizing. And one of the things that also emerges, by the way, in these movements is creative thinking about what can be done. Every movement invents something new. That's one of the greatest things about this for those of us who study it and teach it. Somebody comes along and does something that nobody else has done before. And there were some innovations in Tahrir, in Egypt. Every single campaign. So we learn more as we go. Holistically, it opens up more. We begin to see more possibilities. That's my ferocious response to your very good and important question. Yes, Mohammed.
Thank you very much. I have 2 points actually. The first one is about representation. How does this come, like the representation, when you go and for nonviolent resistance and you call for, like, yes, I'm talking because I'm living in this oppression, I want to talk on, like, the identity, yes, we are citizens. I'm just saying this because of the example, like just a few months ago in Gaza, there was March 15 actions led by youth in Gaza, and all of a sudden you found other political parties holding other youth coalitions to undermine what you are doing. So how come, like, just want to undermine everything you are doing as independent, and they call other group coalitions as independent as well while they are not? So at that point, you lost representation. And at the same time, civil society have been against you because they want to have a credit for a change.
Well, there are 2 problems you're putting your finger on here. One is a less authentic front or segment of the civilian population. By less authentic, I mean not. Let's say that there are 3 major social and economic components of a society that otherwise might be prepared to engage in resistance. And one has a, let's say that one is a group which appears to represent the, just for the sake of the argument, majority political opinion in the society. But another one represents a very important part of the society and has a somewhat different platform and a somewhat different approach. There might even be a third element within the society, this is pretty typical actually, which also has a different source of discontent, a different body of grievances. It's true that there can be competition for the dominant agenda or propositions that are intended to represent the people qua the people. My wager is that the propositions that will be successful in enlarging their representation will be those who are sufficiently represented, are those propositions sufficiently representative of the full buffet table of grievances and discontent that exists within the society, which puts our finger on the chief problem, which is whether those who wish to represent all those who are being cheated from this existing system, who don't have their rights, can be unified or not. My colleague Peter Ackerman insists that there are three irreducible elements of the use of strategic nonviolent action: nonviolent discipline, planning, and unity. And unity doesn't mean unanimity. It doesn't mean everybody has to go along, and if one person holds out, then you can't do a movement. It means that the dominant sentiment in the broad community, whether it's a body of citizens or whether it's a particular region or wherever the campaign or movement is being conducted, have come to recognize the urgency of change, are willing to participate in something to make that change occur, and are willing to affirm in general principles the agenda of change that's represented by the entity, the coalition, or the movement that's organizing that. The kind of competition you've suggested, if I understand your question as well as you've stated it, is normal. What you're describing is not that atypical, but to the extent that there can be a problem if one of the entities is trying to disrupt the attempt to challenge the system. Right. And that comes under the heading of an analytically extremely interesting subject, which many of the veteran practitioners as well as scholars in this field have not finished studying and helping us with, which is, and I'm not being critical of them, it's just one of those things that's historically emergent, it's not sufficiently well understood yet, and that is how to deal with third-party disruptors. They might be fraternal, or they might be external, or they might appear to be popular, but they are really phony because they've been set up by the state, like Nashi in Russia or like the Basiji in Iran, for example. They try to say, well, these people aren't legitimate because, see, we don't represent the regime, but we're going to beat you up and we're going to create, okay. It can be gamed. And in fact, in the new people power nonviolent game, there is a way to take that into consideration and to build, is there not? And to build that into the scenarios that you can yourself devise when the game will be discussed on Thursday night. Brock.
I was interested in the why civil resistance works study.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how they measure success, because on one hand you could say, well, this was successful because they achieved their goal to topple a government. But what if along the way they destroyed agricultural fields and transportation and communication networks and urban infrastructure and things? That's not successful to me because of the costs.
Right.
So
save the question for Erica, because she will give you an answer that is about 10 times better than any answer I could attempt right now. I won't beg off entirely, though. They actually coded individual tactics. They have coded hundreds of thousands of individual tactical actions within all of these hundreds of insurrections, and attempted to notice extent of effectiveness. So it's not just whether the big goal is achieved or not. The most important part of your question is an attempt, did they make an attempt to assess the costs to action takers of engaging in those tactics in relation to the goal? It's fair to assess the cost effectiveness, not simply the goal achievement effectiveness of engaging in nonviolent action. So it's a terrific question. Ask it of Erica. Yes?
I have a similar question, but from a different perspective. So since you give a very excellent overview of the concept of nonviolent resistance, I have a response to that, a friendly challenge. So basically, a small analysis of James Lawrence's Nashville movement. So we see people can gather together in a church, and people can talk about that without worrying about their parents being made jobless, without worrying about their friends being threatened or they themselves being put into prison. So it means what? It means there is a modest degree of civil liberties. The event taking place and can be reported. Okay, so the concept of nonviolent resistance has three parts, in my opinion. The first part is the existence of the modest degree of civil liberties, and the second part is the enlargement of it. That is whatever we are going to learn to do that. And the third part is until it becomes irreversible to initiate policy or regime change. So policy change in Nashville, desegregation. So if without the first part, the existence of modest degree of civil liberties, the concept of nonviolent struggle is none other than a modern mythology. In countries like China, North Korea, like Hitler's Germany, the only way to change the status quo is not nonviolent struggle, but mass incidents or mass violence to wake up the people. Economic breakdown, military intervention by other countries, and people's riots or uprising. So I think in the completely different situations, the responsibility of the patriot is the same. That is to make the dictator's life more miserable. In countries with modest degree of civil liberties, you can wage nonviolent struggles. You can have a solidarity of all, as you said. But in those countries, in extreme oppressive regimes, heroism of a few is the only way possible. So international community, like we see from the past century, has no effective means to deal with Hitler, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, dictators of North Korea, Iraq. It's not because the people there are inferior that they don't know how to make nonviolent struggles, but because they are completely powerless. So I think the concept of nonviolent resistance is not a historical innovation. Gandhi is great, of course, but it's not a historical innovation, but a modern feasibility. In the past, dictators or rulers or emperors, they are extremely ruthless. But in the modern times, they got some culture, the information of the human society become increased. So they are not that ruthless, and that leaves room for nonviolent struggle. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think that we shall appoint you to be the chief skeptic, and we shall use you as a foil, and you will, and we will. You will resist us, and we will resist you. No, I'm joking. What you've said represents a dominant belief about what is really conceived of as a zero-sum game between an oppressor and the oppressed. It presumes that the ground on which the struggle is waged is physical space, in my judgment. It presumes that action requires protected space or space in which organizing and mobilizing for political purposes can occur. But even within by the way, the category of nonviolent resistance that you've defined is anti-authoritarian resistance. There are other categories of resistance which are important because they have a somewhat different chemistry or mechanism of action. And the reason it's important to learn about all kinds of models of nonviolent resistance is because you learn different lessons from different models. And sometimes they're cross-applicable, but have never been cross-applied before. So you have to explore that to see how they're cross-applied. But I'll come back to that. But within the anti-authoritarian model, the belief that first there must be some margin of civil liberties, as you describe it, or space in which to organize and mobilize, is true only if you ignore those movements and campaigns that started with no space. Because some have been started with literally no political space, no civic space, or very little social space. But it turns out that in the society, certain kinds of space existed and were initially exploited for purposes of not political resistance, not even social resistance, but just for individual, independent action. So the real question to ask when you examine a society, even in the context of an anti-authoritarian struggle, is where is there an opportunity for independent action? Because when that opportunity for independent action appears not to pose any threat whatsoever to the state, it may turn out that some degree of independent interaction is possible. This particularly is true when that independent action is cultural, artistic, or is in some way important to the regime's idea that the society is vibrant or fertile or is happy and that it can, in fact, be nice and exist and prosper even under the awning or control of this authoritarian state, which is one of the reasons why we're putting some support into the idea of growing a better understanding of how cultural resistance has worked. What we call cultural resistance has worked in history. The thesis, or the claim, I should say, within the analysis that you've provided, that no resistance is possible against a Hitler or a Stalin, is historically not true in the case of Hitler. Not that the resistance that occurred against Hitler was carried to the point of being politically effective. But if you'll look at the chapter in the A Force More Powerful book called Resisting the Nazis, which is about resistance to German control of occupied Europe in World War II, you'll find a very interesting epilogue about the resistance of German non-Jewish wives to the abduction of their husbands who were Jewish in Berlin after the Battle of Stalingrad, still very much when World War II was at issue and when it wasn't clear that the Allies would eventually win. That resistance was spontaneous but well organized. And it was so spontaneous that it caught the Germans a little bit off guard, and it was primarily women who were doing the resisting. Without understanding what they were doing, the German women were utilizing a political lie of the regime, which was that German women are the backbone of the Nazi Party and the backbone of the German state and German society. And German mothers should, in fact, there's an old expression in America which predates the rise of feminism, which is that you should always keep your wife barefoot and pregnant. That was the essence of the German idea of motherhood, transposed to a European context. But when women organized themselves and put them on the street in front of Gestapo headquarters in Berlin in the fall of 1943, I believe it was, and began to engage in this resistance, the reaction of the Germans, well, at first they didn't take it seriously, and this was actually the use of physical space. It just wasn't cultural, but it was cultural in the sense it was interpreted by the Nazis as cultural because they were all women. So they didn't want to arrest the women because this would be violating something that all the propaganda they'd been spewing out for the previous number of years. But more importantly, it presented a choice, obviously, to the SS. And the choice presented to the SS was, if we arrest these people, then it will become known that we've arrested women whose husbands we've taken away. That doesn't look really good. And so they hesitated. And then the protest grew bigger and bigger. And they had a bigger dilemma on their hands. And ultimately they decided to give them their husbands back. So it was a successful protest. Very shrewd on the part of the Germans because it was over at that point. Because the women never intended a general challenge to the system to begin with. They presented a limited, if you reverse engineer this in the analysis of strategic nonviolent action, you would see that they presented a limited action. You could have done this deliberately if you wanted to start a general political resistance, by not appearing to start a general political resistance, but only by using either spontaneous space or, in the case of cultural resistance, an existing protected space that has never been used before for political purposes. And you don't even say that you're doing it for political purposes, but you engage in it just to exhibit to everybody that something is possible, and also to do something that forces a concession by a state that no one believes would ever furnish a concession. Now, I'm not standing here and telling you that that's immediately cross-applicable to circumstances in China today, writ large or in any particular part of China. But what I am suggesting is that it reduces the challenge to something that helps to attract support and shows people that it is possible to do something, and that produces a possible concession. That, back to the Havel quote, if one person challenges and that challenge is allowed to stand, whether or not it's successful, then then somebody else notices this, and somebody else notices this, and a third person notices this. So my contention would be in disagreement with you, is that even within anti-authoritarian struggles, resistance may be possible if it's not described or advertised or perceived initially as resistance. Why? Because, and this is the big lesson, you're not trying to do a coup. You're not trying to overthrow the government. If you think you are we trying to overthrow governments? Are we trying to that's the big charge against nonviolent resistance, that it's about regime change, and they want it to be only about regime change. Why? Because they want to reduce it to its the least form of it, which is that we want you guys out of power. Sometimes it's necessary to enlarge a problem in order to solve it. And my contention is that just because there are authoritarian regimes which want their opponents to be labeled as interested only in regime change and then attack every other organization in the world that wants to help them do that, is because they recognize that what really is at stake is changing the society, is moving the society into a completely different historic space that then renders the ability to do authoritarianism impossible, because the people have changed too. You have to change the people. Movements change the people. Movements change the society. They don't just do regime change. But if you want to do regime change, start by asking yourself the question, how do we change the people? and how do we change the society? And what can they do to begin that process of changing the people and changing the society? It may seem even bigger, a more mammoth task, but out of that process of analysis and consideration of the circumstances you face may come ideas for initial resistance that no one has ever thought of before. The worst cases produce the best ideas, typically because the stress is greater and the seeming potential for action is less. I'm not going to go back to you to give, because we only have 5 minutes left and I want to go to a few other people. But because this debate is going to go on all week, I suspect. So, Luisa.
Okay, I have 3 questions that are connected, and is what if the oppressor is a criminal? And is not just a criminal; it's a bunch of criminals. And what are the options when the value of life seems to be destroyed by an oppressor that keeps the advantage of the conflict out of the conflict?
Say that again.
What are the options when the value of life seems to be destroyed by an oppressor that keeps taking advantage of that conflict? And in which civil terms you could establish resistance when the structure is more than political criminal?
Good question. We confronted this the first time, I say we, those of us who work at for and with ICNC, when we did a workshop in Guatemala 4 years ago at the request of the Minister of Peace of Guatemala, the Minister of Peace responsible for the internal peace that was resolved by national agreement when the previous military regime was displaced as a part of what political scientists call a pacted transition, although that was at the end of a long, bloody civil struggle. She had, through a friend, heard about our work and read one pamphlet actually by Gene Sharp, because at the time it was the only thing we had to give away that was in Spanish. She read it, and I was meeting with her, and she held up this, she didn't speak English, and I didn't speak Spanish, but there was a translator, and she said, "Does what you do workshops on have anything to do with this pamphlet?" And I said, "Oh yeah." She said, "Okay, then I want you to come down and do a workshop for all of my local representatives from around the country, because we have many problems with violence in Guatemala, which was a democracy, a nominal democracy." So we went down and we did a workshop, and we ran through all of our standard material. It wasn't as well contextualized for this kind of a struggle as it would be today. But, and the discussion, the question you just asked was asked at that workshop, or forms of it were asked at that workshop. And they described a society in which there were self-constituted gangs who preyed upon innocent civilians in order to do trafficking, in order to make money off drugs, in order to make a profit and live in the society outside civil order, but inside their own space which they had set up. But the price being paid, the cost imposed on ordinary people, was rising higher and higher and higher, to the point that, and the state wasn't doing anything about it because the state was bribed to not pay attention to the crime that was going on. And so we explored that in the course of this workshop. This is an example of something that was brought up before, which is when there is a third force in the society, which is either supporting the state but not appearing to, or just trying to stand on its own and receive benefit from its use or threat of violence, what can the people do? And the consensus in the room after we experimentally went through our workshop, we didn't try to give them answers. We wanted the answers to come from them because they were the ones who lived in the society after we just talked about what civil resistance is all about. And they came to the conclusion that the responsibility in a democracy for protection of the people belonged to the state, who was supposed to represent them, but they weren't being represented. So the problem was the state wasn't representing them. So even though the problem was coming from a third force their opponent was still the government, because the government was failing. And the lie that the democratic government was telling was that this was a tolerable society in which to live. It wasn't tolerable if people's daughters were being pressed into being kidnapped and taken into trafficking rings, or just taken away as sex slaves, essentially. And other violence was being done to local communities, making even local government difficult to do. So the actions that they began to think of in that brief workshop were actions that were still directed against the state. And there was one exercise in which they were asked, something was being done by one of the trainers who was involved in that workshop, challenging them to come up with a simple statement, like one sentence, that represented the kind of society in which they wanted to live. And the goals were interesting because you can clearly see that it's not an anti-authoritarian struggle, that they were not unhappy with the form of government they had. They weren't unhappy with the degree of political liberty they had, but they were very unhappy with the society in which they lived. And so the two words which kept coming up more and more and more in the slogan they came up with was, we want a fair Guatemala, in which Guatemala is fair to everyone, and we want a safe Guatemala, in which Guatemala is safe for everyone. The emphasis was everyone, fair, and safe. All of this involved the political order. So effectively they were saying was the entire political order was rotten, even though it was democratic, because these demands of ordinary people were flouted every day, and they paid the costs. The people, sitting in Parliament weren't paying the cost, sitting in Guatemala City weren't paying the cost, people in the countryside were paying the cost. So what this released in them was a lot of different, sort of a different way of thinking. All I can tell you is that this brief exposure to the basic ideas of civil resistance began to get people thinking about ways in which they could, where should they start. It was about organizing and mobilizing and taking action, and then you have to have a target for the action. Who are the target? Who are the, and there was no question but that this was at that point in time, and my knowledge of Guatemala stems only from that period of time that I was in the country, not today, but that government was a fat, juicy, soft target. No question, because of the failure of the government to continue to win the consent or the acquiescence of people who were, but these people, there were people in the workshop other than just the representatives of the Minister of Peace, but even the local representatives of the Minister of the Peace had been extremely frustrated because they thought there was nothing they could do. What do? We go, we meet with the parliamentary, they said, oh, you're absolutely right, we'll do something, and then nothing happens. That was their frustration, the typical frustration in an active democracy today. By the way, Bill Martell's session, which is supposed to start at 2 o'clock, won't start until 2:30, so we have maybe another 10 minutes here before we can break for lunch and still be able to be back in time for Bill to return. Dalia.
Well, I have a couple of questions, but I'll just have one at a time. There's cases where people try to have a non-violent, like a march or a sit-in or whatever, and suddenly the enemy becomes, I don't want to use the word enemy because it's not violent, but the enemy becomes from the government to the people around them. In the cases, for example, in Khartoum, where we do go out on protests or marches or whatever, a lot of the general public criticize and stigmatize the people that are walking out, telling them that they're disrupting the peace and that we should all go home, and we don't know what's going to happen to us and whatever. But at the end, we become like an enemy to our own people. So how does this approach? How does it work so that it's a way? You don't want to increase your enemies. The idea is to get people on your side. So what happens with these type of attempts is that the opposite. More people don't like you type of.
Well, that's successful to the extent that the government or the regime can make people believe that the people engaging in the protest are a tiny group, an unrepresentative group, a group that is bizarre or peeved in some sort of, to be dismissed, you have to be seen effectively as a crank, to use the English word, or as someone who is just, a troublemaker. You counter that by being diverse, by using discourse which everyone in the society, whether they've been mobilized or not, recognizes as something that accurately describes the problem. And also by engaging in actions. Sometimes there are malign and there are benign. There are disputatious and consensus building foundations for defining the problem that you as leaders or activists in a campaign or movement are undertaking. And if you appear reasonable, it's harder to make you look like you're unreasonable. If what you're saying is reasonable, it's harder for the regime to say what they're saying, they're just trying to make trouble, they're trying to create instability. Every regime says these people are going to upset the apple cart and everybody's going to lose because they're upsetting the apple cart. So some of this is solved through discourse, some of it's solved through how you organize and who you try to bring into the demonstration, and most importantly, the design of the tactic. And in Hardy's session this afternoon on forming a movement, this is potentially front and center. He'll be able to put a gloss on this that's much better. Tian Chang.
In your presentation, you mentioned a figure I believe is very persuasive. You say in the past 3 decades, 50 out of 67.
Louder.
Oh, I'm still music. You mentioned that 50 out of the 67.
Yeah, 67.
Yeah, a democratic transition in the past 3 decades. Nonviolent action plays a very key factor, key role. I believe this figure is very persuasive. But I please define key factor. Do you mean just under high pressure, the authoritarian regime chooses transformation, or you bring the government to a negotiation table, or simply overthrow it? What do you mean? What do you mean by key factor?
There were some pacted transitions, which is to say roundtable or negotiation-based transitions that you get to that moment often through aggressive use of civil resistance. But there were some of those transitions in that number in the 50 of the 67. There were also some somewhat more classic quote-unquote regime change or quick transitions in which a government is forced out, resigns, or the military defects, and therefore it dissolves. There were some of those represented in that as well. This is actually in a struggle called How Freedom is Won. You can download this from our website at nonviolent-conflict.org. You'll see it under, I think, reports. I think the functional category under resources, resource library, reports, How Freedom is Won. And you'll see the full study. If I were to reduce the essence of that study, it's to notice whether there was operating in the society a broad popular-based coalition of forces that was pretty diverse and representing broad-based discontent, and that they were engaging in a lot of nonviolent actions of one kind or another over a period of time. That's what you'll see a more technical definition of the force that it is believed was the but-for factor in those 50 of 67 transitions. And that's usually a coalitional nonviolent force. It doesn't mean that there's a specific, like type of organization you have to qualify for that. And it covers a lot of different kinds of transitions, to be sure. But the data on that is contained in that report. That report was disputed, and then there was another report which answered the objections, and so there's a little debate that report spawned. But it was really one of the first, amazing that it only came in 2005, to try to get after quantification of those. Anything over here that's really, really important? Susanna?
It's just a technical observation. It's a question. When we are talking about non-violent conflict, we are talking about conflict resolution, or we are talking about conflict transformation, as defined about as Netherlands defined conflict transformation. And if we are talking about conflict transformation in conflicts where they are like different, it's not like an oppressor. It's more like a difference between groups because we are different religion or because we are different races or what they call race, or what's the role of recognition of the other if we are talking about conflict transformation?
Well, you can recognize you're living under an oppressor. You can recognize that other people in the society share that condition. This week is not really about conflict transformation or conflict resolution. It's about winning a conflict. It's about understanding that you're engaged in a conflict or struggle and determining how you can succeed by being victorious, by actually changing power relationships within the society or displacing an entire regime if that's part of the transformation. But you're correct in another sense when you suggest that this is a transformation, as I said in my presentation. Transformations aren't necessarily produced just through discussion and negotiation and concession and sacrifice and reconciliation. Sometimes it can happen because people who refuse to do that have their power taken away from them. And then that makes the transformation a lot more, much easier to do after that occurs. In fact, I would argue that, and some people make this argument, although I won't necessarily, that the color revolutions were a failure because all it did was do regime change, but there was no transformation in the society. Some people make that claim. There can be reasons for that. The movement demobilizes instead of recognizing that the revolution is never over until there has been a transformation of the society. Much of what you learn under the heading of conflict resolution and conflict transformation comes in very handy during the course of the life of a movement, and particularly during the transition, so-called transition, after there has been at least a change in the political order. I hope that helps to reconcile the terminology a little bit. Terence?
Yeah, but would you agree that in some recent cases, despite all the present factors that you spoke about, it simply doesn't work? You mentioned Belarus, for example. And, well, we have the situation when the authorities are almost deprived of their legitimacy, when people understand that they have to put a stop and, the people are rising, but at some point it doesn't work. Just as an assumption, maybe it's worth to consider as a part of the strategy how to influence law enforcement institutions. Because when you have strong law enforcement institution, no matter how high the level of popular movement is, it won't bring any result. What do you think?
You again sound, if you're talking about Belarus and if you're talking inside the normal frame for an anti-authoritarian model and therefore an anti-authoritarian conflict, what you say certainly appears to be the case. No question about that. I can't stand here and give you an answer for Belarus. I mean, I'm to some extent familiar with the circumstances in that country. But one of the interesting changes in the way that any model for understanding potential resistance can be considered and can be applied is the increased sophistication of external sanctions on authoritarian rulers. The sanctions being used today are rather more subtle and sophisticated than they were 10 or 20 years ago. None of us who write about this believe that external factors can, on their own, accomplish political change. It must be done indigenously. However, it's worth thinking through how legitimacy can be globalized. Think of it in those terms. The legitimacy of a government has to be perceived not only as legitimate to its own people, but it has to be perceived as legitimate to outside authorities. Why does Roberto Mugabe go to the trouble, the unbelievable diplomatic trouble, of trying to go to Rome for, what is it, the World Food Organization meeting every year? It's like, because Berlusconi will let him into Italy, so he can get headlines for being in Italy. Somehow he's still a ruler who's capable of traveling. The rest of Europe won't let him in because the way he's governed Zimbabwe has been so odious that they won't let him in. But Berlusconi lets him in to Rome, so he can be, pictures can be taken. That seems to be important inside his head, that he's able to get into Italy on some way. Even rulers have to hold on to some sense of their own legitimacy. I'm reminded, and Maciej knows about, in fact, I gave Maciej this anecdote. Unfortunately, I can't remember where I read it, but I know I read it. Or I know I did it, I came across it in the research for the A Force More Powerful book. Jaruzelski, the former general, then head of the communist state head of the Communist Party in communist-ruled Poland, was apparently able to maintain harmony in his own personal household during the worst of the challenge of solidarity to his control of Poland, even when it was underground, until the European Union raised the level of sanctions, made the sanctions more personal, and said that members of the families of specific regime actors could no longer travel. And his wife was denied access to Paris from that point forward. And he wrote in his memoirs that and he wasn't just joking, life became significantly more difficult for him personally when that happened. He, of course, made the decision voluntarily to relinquish power in a roundtable process at the end of that same decade, after which point, presumably, his wife was allowed back to Paris. But there are, one of the reasons, it is, I don't know that this is a fact, but it is possible that one of the reasons now that there is fratricide going on within the ruling group in Iran may be because of this new system of personal sanctions against specific regime, against some people, but not everybody. My hunch is that, I don't know this for a fact, I'm just guessing, my hunch is that whoever was designing these sanctions said, we put sanctions on this person, but not on this person. Imagine how that will change the relationship between them. That means to me, I think, many people think this, I mean, and this is not my idea, but I find it credible, and that is that in the case of Belarus, the need for whoever is the president of Belarus to pretend that there is a new potential historic relationship with Western Europe, with essentially the European Union, is something that is important to that president's legitimacy or the perceived effectiveness or likely rationality of his rule. So the question is how that can be utilized by people within the country or by people who are outside and would like a change. That's just one long example of a certain category of actions. I'm running out of steam.
Just one more last question before lunch.
Thank you. You framed a lot of the discussion as a relationship between truth-telling and lying. And I was fascinated by how you said that the resistance movement is essentially a de facto truth-teller. That if you participate in it, you tell the truth. Do you find that it keeps itself honest? What keeps the movement honest? What keeps it telling the truth?
I think there's a direct relationship between effectiveness and honesty in almost any department of life. If you're dishonest for long enough, the gears will start grinding down. But that's a general proposition about the way human life works, less an answer to your question. But it is an interesting question because it would require us to go back and to see what movements did resort to disinformation as a deliberate tactic attempting to say something, for example, about a government which wasn't true. We once were asked to do a workshop with an organization that wanted to include in the workshop on nonviolent action bribing police officers. And we said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. You have to be better than the people you're trying to replace. You don't fight fire with fire in this instance. That's not for moral reasons, it's for effectiveness reasons. Imagine if this comes out. You'll be discredited in an instant. You can't win the contest for legitimacy if you bribe somebody. But I would also apply that to dishonesty. If you invented, for example, an allegation based on facts which could be disproven, you'd be exposing yourself to telling lies, and then that sacrifices the position of being able to. So now that's a theoretical answer. That's not a practical answer. Standing here, what does not immediately come to mind is an example of a movement or a campaign that actually employed a dishonest proposition or a proposition that wasn't true. I think it's sort of built in to the structure of effectiveness, if that makes any sense. I think that there is a direct relationship. Why is there that direct relationship between honesty and effectiveness? Probably because people are not going to join your movement unless they think that you're telling them the truth. So if you're going to lie to that person, why would you not lie to them? And also because they may begin to doubt your assessment. They may begin to doubt other aspects of the strategy. Gandhi was as transparent as any movement leader about the elements of his strategy. Once or twice, famously and pivotally, he wrote an open letter to the Viceroy in which he said, here are all the things we're going to do in the next several months. And essentially, he gave up the advantage of surprise and basically says, here's what we're going to do. But the idea of transparent strategy there were a number of components to it. One, psychologically, was sort of a way of saying, we're going to win even when we tell you what we're going to do in advance. We're so confident that we will be successful. But he was sort of forced into it tactically because it was also a way of acquainting everybody, potentially, with what he was going to do. That also helps to derive creativity from the grassroots. So there are lots of good, sound strategic reasons why he decided to have a transparent strategy. I would say the closer you are to a fully transparent strategy, which really obviously requires honesty, the more effective you will likely be. But that does have to do with the degree of political space which you have either managed to open or which has, by historical readiness, somehow miraculously arrived. Thank you.